What y'all listening to?
Limelight Highlight Podcast.
And welcome back to Limelight Highlight, a safe space and great place for a positive outlook on life. As always, I'm your host, Jonathan Rosario, or J Rose, or John Rio, whatever you like to call me. I've accrued many names over the years. It's been a while since we've put out a podcast. I've been trying to revamp and reorganize the show into something a little more entertaining, along with making some changes while we grow. The podcast will now be dropping every Tuesday instead of Mondays, besides this day specifically, because just trying to put everything together. I've been joined and been asked to join a few groups in the podcasting industry that's full of helpful people, so I'll be bouncing around ideas and seeing what fits and what doesn't. I'd like the podcast to be a place where people can pick up ideas and topics to discuss with one another, and a place to get some positive information about things going on in the country and the world in a fun and entertaining way. So to my listeners that have been with me from the start, I just want to say thank you for your continued support and continuing to grow with me. And to those just joining, I hope you enjoy what you hear and you keep coming back. Now let's get on with the show. Fun fact I recently stumbled upon is grapes explode when you put them in the microwave. Like within 2 seconds, or just within seconds. 2 halves of a grape burst into fireballs in the microwave. Has absolutely no relation to what we're going to talk about today. I just thought it was an interesting fact and wanted to share. Disclaimer, just to protect myself, I'm absolutely not telling you to try this at home, no matter how bored you are during this quarantine. But other things that we are going to go over will be problems and solutions that we're facing during this pandemic of the coronavirus, and you get to learn about a couple sources that could possibly be helpful or useful to you if you're interested in helping or looking for certain nonprofit organizations. Our first problem that we're going to talk about is a problem that we've covered time and time again, and that is the environmental impact that we have on the world. I know I've beaten a dead horse by this point, but we know all too well how much negative impact we have on the world. But after these recent articles that I've read, it's kind of mind-blowing how much our everyday activities really affect the world around us. I want to start off with how this virus is affecting our biggest U.S. cities, which in turn is affecting the environment. And I got a lot of this information from the New York Times. So according to the New York Times, traffic and air pollution plummet as U.S. cities shut down. Obviously, apparently there's satellite technology that can detect emissions in the atmosphere linked to cars and trucks. And the images show a huge decline in pollution over some real major cities like LA, for example. The data shows that emissions were dramatically lower in the first 2 weeks of March compared to the same time last year. Once again, it's pretty obvious why. And if you didn't know, LA has some of the highest smog levels in the country. There's like a cloud of smog when you're driving up to LA if you're coming from Southern California. It's kind of disgusting, but apparently that thing's not there anymore. In Seattle, kind of the same thing. Air pollution from vehicles has likewise plummeted in the area. Traffic decreased as well because obvious reasons again. But visits to bulk retailers like Costco and different grocery stores are shooting up dramatically. In New York, people rely more on public transportation than their own vehicles, but the article says that this shouldn't be a silver lining because once everything goes back to normal, the pollution will as well. But I disagree. I think it is a positive thing that we need to focus on because they're saying it's not a sustainable way to reduce air pollution. But if anything, this shows that we should be doing everything we can to change our dependence on fossil fuels and switch to cleaner and renewable energy. And speaking of things getting cleaner, it's been reported outside of the country that since the lockdown in Venice, the canals have become crystal clear, and Italy's coasts have dolphins coming nearer and nearer for, the first time in recent years. In Japan, there's deer that live in the Nara Park that kind of get fed by people in the park, but now they're roaming the streets looking for food because they're often fed in the park. Same thing in Thailand. Local monkeys are in herds walking the streets, also looking for food because of how much they depend on the human interaction and tourists feeding them. It's kind of sad. But according to CNET, since the lockdown, reductions in coal and crude oil burning has decreased by 25% compared to the same time last year. That's about 100 metric tons of CO2 or 6% of global emissions over the same period. That's a pretty big deal. I'm not a math major, but that's a lot of emissions that have been dramatically decreased. So we can see how the virus has shifted the way things are, like the way we have it structured and set up. Some good, like the reduction in pollution, which leads to cleaner air and water, but also showing some of the problems that we didn't realize we really had, like wild animals relying on humans for food, if you consider that a problem. But if this virus shows us anything, it's that if we just gave the earth a little bit of room to breathe, it's kind of capable of bouncing back to an extent. Might be a fantasy of mine, or it is a fantasy of mine, but imagine if they took this time to really enact some restrictions and pollution so we could take the momentum of the less traffic and clean air and clean water and continue to build on that. But I have no idea how those policies work, and I doubt anything will change because we got a big problem to deal with, and that I think takes precedent. But hopefully this is a wake-up call and they revisit these problems to come up with some more permanent solutions. Next, I'd like to talk about the virus and how it's affecting our society. I'm sure you guys seen in the news and all types of media platforms that people are freaking out, buying all the goods in bulk, leaving the shelves in stores bare and not being able to meet with high demand. What those people are doing is just hurting others trying to buy regularly, which they should be doing. It's showing how fragile our society is because everyone is looking out for themselves instead of trying to come together. At least that's what the media likes to really show and would like you to think. But while there are douchebags out there hoarding all the goods and not really caring about anyone else, I've seen a huge growth in specific posts on social media platforms, just reaching out to those in need, saying stuff like, don't feel ashamed to reach out if you need my help, or normal people are preparing food for families and kids that aren't able to provide for themselves. It's times like this that we really are coming together, and we need to be coming together and helping each other out. It's a real feeling and a sense of community that's being shown, and I think that's something worth pointing out. Even big stores are putting limits on how much a certain person can buy with certain items, or they have certain hours where the elderly are allowed to, specifically just people over a certain age can go in and purchase goods for themselves before anybody else, because people are savages, But speaking of media, I don't know. I know how much people didn't trust the news before, but it's just kind of getting worse due to the poor coverage of everything going on, and plus the way everything's been acted upon. I think people think it's not a big deal. Or you got people talking about conspiracies that are circling around how it's a man-made virus and biowarfare and all this false information, which is really dangerous. People are dying, and even if you may not feel like it's as big a deal as it is, or that it's being made out to be, when people are dying and there's not a complete understanding of how the virus really works, the least you can do is just follow instructions on staying home and really work on that social distancing as much as you possibly can. If it wasn't that big of a deal, the entire world wouldn't be self-quarantining and shutting down on non-essential travel, business, and activities. The fact that other countries, including ours, are doing that should raise huge red flags and should be taken serious. But the positive is that we're now seeing how we weren't prepared for something like this, and we can learn from these mistakes, and people are educating themselves on proper hygiene, which is kind of weird that we had to have something like this happen for them to understand not only proper hygiene, but they're having an understanding, as minimal as it might be, of how viruses spread and how people are taking proper precautions. The pandemic is it's showing how much we need change. It's showing our vulnerabilities as a species and how our current structure doesn't really work as well as we have been led to believe it does. And hopefully these holes in our society are going to get patched up with a better system and solutions in case something like this ever happens in the future, because most likely it will. I mean, this is not the first pandemic that we've dealt with, but in recent times this is the most crucial, I think. And finally, this pandemic is showing how it's not a class or a race thing. It can happen to anyone, rich or poor. Politicians of the highest caliber to A-list actors are being infected. And even though we have a long ways to go with proper testing and the availability of the testing for poor and disenfranchised neighborhoods and people, this should also be a red flag of how serious it is. We're going to get through this, but definitely at a high cost. The cost of lives and loved ones. So appreciate your neighbor and have a little compassion for those who aren't as fortunate, and definitely lend a helping hand any way you can. Now, there are a huge list of nonprofits helping with the coronavirus. There's a website called Charity Navigator, and it's a major charity assessment organization that evaluates charitable organizations in the U.S., and it accepts no advertising or donations from the organizations that it evaluates, which I think is a pretty big deal because that shows that they're less likely to be biased. So if you go to their website, there's a list of nonprofits that are helping with this pandemic, and they all have little ratings. It's pretty cool. It tells you how transparent they are and things of that nature. But these nonprofits that are helping with this pandemic that we have going on right now, they're all featured and listed. And there's a few categories, and they describe how they're helping. I'm just gonna read you the highlighted categories in case one catches your attention and you'd like to look into it further. So the first category they have is medical services. Partnering with medical teams to combat COVID-19, organizations featured are based on their overall Charity Navigator score. And if you want to look at the charity supporting the cause, there's a link that you can click. The next category is relief supplies, which are health and medical. And they're providing much needed medical supplies to hospitals and health facilities. Organizations featured are based on their overall Charity Navigator score. Once again, they're all based on the Navigator score. The next category is the cross-categorical, providing much needed assistance across multiple areas. And the next one is funding local organizations, which is partnering with local organizations to ensure communities across the country have the resources and support they need. The next is education and awareness, which is raising awareness of ways to prevent COVID-19 and how to cope with the stress it's causing. Then you have relief supplies, community support and services, which is supporting the safety nets of our society and protecting the most vulnerable. And that's it. That's the last category. But it's specifically COVID-19 coronavirus charitynavigator.org. And yeah, we're coming to the end of the show. But before I let you go, I do want to bring back a segment that I had in mind when I first started the podcast. The segment is about highlighting organizations that are making a difference. And this week I'd like to highlight Chick-fil-A. I came across a story while I'm looking through social media and stuff like that. And the story was how Chick-fil-A delivered 350 meals to hospital workers at Peace Health Southwest in Vancouver, Washington. This was back on March 15th, and they gave out free meals to thank the employers for their hard work during the coronavirus pandemic. This is a pretty simple yet gracious gesture that I thought deserved a little bit of highlighting, and just kind of wanted to share with you that there are even big businesses out there really willing to do some of the things to help by even providing a free meal. Just to recap, we covered how this pandemic is affecting the environment, our society, and how we interact with each other. And I gave you guys some resources that you can look up to find organizations dedicating themselves to helping out during this crazy time. At the end of the day, this virus is a pandemic and should be taken extremely serious. People are dying and experiencing hardships in more ways than one. And I hope this episode gave you some silver linings